Okay, everybody, hello. This is me just talking again about JavaScript data structures. So coming back to the concept of text as data that we talked a little bit about just in the TEI lecture, but getting us closer to our assignment. So for your assignment, you will need to know in particular or especially about two kinds of JavaScript data structures, arrays and objects. So first, let's talk about arrays. An array is a list of elements. The array itself is delimited by square brackets, and the elements of the array are delimited by commas. So we have here an array declaration. Let's define a variable. The variable's name is my array, and it is equal to whatever comes after the equal sign. In this case, what comes after the equal sign is an array. So note that in this array definition, we have three kinds of elements, which I haven't talked about yet, but which you might as well learn a little tiny bit about. The first kind is a string. A string is a collection of characters. It can be any valid character surrounded by quotation marks. The quotation marks, please take a look at this, are plain quotes. They are not smart quotes as might be inserted by your word processor. So this is one of the main reasons you should never use a word processor when you're working on technical material, because your word processor, many other programs as well, will try to smarten up your writing by replacing the plain quotes with smart quotes. That will break your code. So really make sure that you're not using a word processor at all. And we see that each of the four elements at the beginning is a string. So we have some, and then collection, and then of, and then things. And then those first four elements are followed by three numbers. A number in JavaScript is just a collection of numerals and possibly a period to indicate a decimal point. And we have here the numbers 4, 7, and 34, 58. So those are our first 7 elements of the array. That's fairly straightforward. Now when we get to the 8th element of the array, we notice, whoa, the 8th element of the array is also an array. So we have Matryoshka dolls, nested arrays inside the array, the array proper. So that's just to give you a very quick hint of how data structures can become, as it were, arbitrarily complex. And we can see that happening already here. So let's go on to talk about the second kind of JavaScript data structure that you need to be familiar with, and that is a JavaScript object. Like the CSS rules that we just saw before, and this can be somewhat confusing, a JavaScript object is delimited by curly braces and is made up of key value pairs with a property name, a colon, and then a property value. And so just notice this is probably the key thing you have to understand. You have to remember syntactically that in JavaScript objects, the property value pairs are separated by commas. In CSS, they're separated by semicolons. Anyway, so we have here a first property title, whose value is the string I am a collection of key value pairs. The second property is separation, whose value is always separated by commas. And then a third value, possible values, whose value is an array. So just like an element of an array can be an array, a property of an object can be an array. In fact, a property of an object can even be another object. It could, and so it's an object in this case with a bunch of its own values. We could even have another object inside there. We could have an array inside there. We could have an object with an array inside it. So the nesting of JavaScript objects can be arbitrarily complex. Yeah, so in a real setting, there will be objects with very deep nesting and complex structures. But for us, it's relatively simple. And I just wanted to point out that the property names are usually unquoted, and that's the best way to do it. But in the case of our assignment, the property names are all quoted. You can leave those quotes in there. You can take them out if you feel like it. It's not really that important. In every other moment in JavaScript, the presence or absence of quotes is actually super important, but in this moment it's not. And the reason that we end up having quotes is because there is a very closely related format called the JavaScript object notation, JSON, which is used to move data from one place to another. And in JSON, the quotes on the property names are mandatory. And I generated that, our initial text using JSON. Anyway, you don't have to think too much about that. I just want you to be aware of that kind of oddity in the code. So in our assignment, we have a data structure that is an array, and each element of the array, or most of the elements of the array, is a stanza. And the stanza has a couple of very simple properties, type and class, and meta, which is usually empty. And then it has the property content. And content, the stanza content is generally going to be quite complex. In this case, the stanza is an array of other objects, lines. And the content of each line is itself an array of words and punctuation marks. So we have a pretty heavily nested structure in terms of what we've seen. And your job is going to be to take the existing structure and make it slightly more complex. And we can see this in the next slide. It's the final slide in this tiny lecture. Your main job is going to be to add classes to existing elements, and maybe some meta if there's some comment you want to make and you want to make it apparent to the reader. So you can see here I added the class of death to eulogy and the class of time to moment. I also was kind of looking at this line, whose content is without a eulogy or a moment of silence, and I thought moment of and silence are all words, and they're defined as words by the algorithm that made this initial data structure. But what the unit that's really significant to us is the phrase moment of silence. And so I thought, why not just introduce a new element here? And so because this works out okay, because of the way that the data structure is processed, I can just do that. So I created a new object in this array of the line. So we have all these words, and then I inserted a new object with type phrase, class nothing, a meta. So this is going to be a kind of comment on moment of silence. And I wrote, to be without a moment of silence amidst the grieving, the agony is awful. It's maybe not the most intelligent thing you could say about this phrase, but anyway, the phrase struck me. And then for the content of the phrase, I just took the existing 3 words, and so I moved them inside a Matryoshka doll, as it were, like inside another Russian doll. And so here we have examples of adding classes, adding meta, and also adding new content. And in fact, I think that you can see this right here. Yeah, no, I didn't do it. Right here. We can do it in moment of silence right here. Let me replace that. Let's do this right here. I'm going to save that, and here's the moment of silence. To view that moment of silence amidst the grief menu, the agony is awful. Anyway, that's just a little example. That's the JavaScript part of your assignment. That's your introduction to JavaScript structures, and I'm going to talk a little bit about CSS in one last lecture.